Hi, this is Scott Bradfield. This is episode 11 of Reading Great Books in the Bathtub. And we're chapter 3 of our reading of Ulysses. Our challenge is to read it like normal human beings who would pick up a book and try to find their way through it and understand the characters and what's happening to them, and to avoid any sort of reference books or any sort of expertise in explaining to us what we should like about the book. Okay, chapter 3 is our first big challenge. I'm arguing that the first two chapters of Ulysses are beautiful pieces of narrative writing. They set up point of view very quickly. They let us know when we're seeing things, when we're hearing Stephen's thoughts, when we know dialogue is being spoken, when things are imagined, and when they are real. And we can make these shifts as we read the story with often very small details, small physical details, small sensory details that help land us in this world of Stephen and a bunch of clever schoolboys on the one hand, and Bloom and his really complicated romantic life on the other hand. The first two chapters set up these sort of rules fairly clearly. They're extremely, difficult, and they require a lot of patience and attention, but you don't need any books to understand them. When you get to chapter 3, Joyce starts to twist the knife a bit. He starts to challenge you a lot more, and he shifts the rules. Okay, he's going to do this in every single chapter of the book from now on. He's going to set up a different set of narrative ideas, and we're going to have to start to question how we read the earlier chapters. Later in the book, he'll come up with very challenging and very, very overly clever sometimes new narrative setups. And the stories, each chapter is going to be a different experiment in how to tell the same story about the same people. Think of it as that. Each one is a different narrative experiment, often based on other narrative ideas at the time, such as at one point the romance novel, or a theatrical piece, or question and answers, a logical question and answer session. So we're going to get into very, very radical shifts later, and we're starting to get them now in chapter 3. Chapter 3 is difficult to my mind because we are really deep into Stephen's head. Stephen's head is extremely overly clever. He's I think he believes he's a Jesuit-trained kid, really smart, very contemptuous of the world around him, often trying to show how clever he is, rehearsing clever things to say in his head. My least favorite are all the puns and word jokes that Joyce goes off to turn into Finnegan's Wake, and I think an unreadable book. And the puns and their super cleverness is starting to percolate through in this chapter. It's an easy book chapter to be confused by. I wanted to just go through very quickly today, not spend a long time on this chapter, except to warn you that you do need to pay attention. It's not easy to tell when you're seeing the real world or when you're not. I'd like to point those passages out to you. And there's my dog back there. And to help you understand where to pay attention and where not to. Let's look at the opening paragraph, because we're going to see the difficult and annoying parts of this chapter, to my mind, and some of the good parts. It starts like this. Ineluctable modality of the visible. At least that, if no more, thought through my eyes. Signatures of all things I am here to read. Sea spawn and sea wrack, the nearing tide, that rusty boot. Snot green, blue silver rust, colored signs. The colors are signs. Limits of the diaphane. Okay, let's look at that one phrase. It's going to come up again and again. Ineluctable modality of the visible. Ineluctable, something you can't prevent from coming up. Like a geyser is ineluctable. Modality would be, again, I'm not an expert in philosophy, and there'll be 100 essays and books about the philosophical underpinnings of this passage. We're going to skip all of them. We don't care if it's Leibniz or Aristotle. We don't care. We're going to just think about what Stephen's thinking about. He's referring to lots of clever philosophers in his head. He's mixing their ideas up, but we care about what's happening to Stephen. So we have this world around us. Remember, we've shifted scenes. We've left Mr. Deasy's house, and we don't describe everything that happens. We just land at the beach, and Stephen goes for a walk. That's the whole chapter, is going for a walk. Nothing significant happens to Stephen, though a few incidents will occur that we need to remember. The foam and the seaweed and the junk and the rusty old boot lying on the sand are in front of Stephen now. And he's thinking, what do they represent? That's really intellectual modality of the visible. What in our heads is making sense of these things, and what are they to us? And he's suggesting that all of them are ideas. Everything he sees are an idea. Okay, I don't want to go much further than that because we're going to see this visible world. I don't understand exactly what he's arguing all the time, and I'm not going to try to. But that the visualization of this world is something important to try to understand to him. And again, this is a guy who doesn't believe in God. It's going to come up in this chapter. But that it has some meaning to him when he looks at it. And we're going to see some nice description. As this opening goes along, now you'll see the opening paragraphs. And look, here's the chapter start. There's that line here in my edition. Some books have different ways of marking the chapters. But I think this is the best edition to have, especially if you get the one without the notes in back. Just for the challenge, not to be checking notes. We're going to do something that he does in most of his narrative passages, which is he's going to start the paragraph often locating us. No cleverness, just locating us. This first paragraph, the second paragraph is a good example of what I'm saying. Paragraph 2. Stephen closed his eyes to hear his boots crush crackling rack and shells. Good. Again, these lovely sensory sentences of Joyce's. Second paragraph locates us. It shows us what Stephen's doing. We are physically active with Stephen. Very typical narrative gimmick or technique in fiction. And then we'll go into his head. You are walking through it howsoever. I am astride at a time. I won't keep going. But we get that opening. That opening sentence is really one to flag when you're reading through this chapter and in most of Ulysses, because that's going to locate you with the character more often than not. All right. Now in that paragraph he says, "My ash sword hangs at my side." That's his walking cane, and he's imagining himself walking along the beach, which is all he does in this, and sits down. That's all he does in the chapter. And he walks along with this cane, and then he says, "Tap with it." They do. He's referring to blind people. Okay? He's pretending what it would be like if I was blind. This is a motif that's going to keep coming up in the book. You'll see Bloom looking at a blind man. Being blind is an issue that interests Joyce, who's losing his sight, as you know. And at the same time, we're in a chapter where he's saying, well, the language of the world is visual. It's what I see. There's also a language I hear, but what I see is more important. What happens if I lose that? So that's the biggest emotional connection for Stephen in this walk. Now, as he's walking along, I don't want to go into all of this, but he sings some songs. He thinks about the rhyme schemes for them and the type of metrical arrangements in them. He starts to reflect on his friends, and he sees, I believe, on page 46, he sees Mrs. Florence McCabe, who I believe, again, I forget at the moment, I think she's the midwife, and her husband, Patrick McCabe, has just died, and we're going to go to, I think it's Patrick McCabe's funeral we go to later. I can't remember. Again, when we first come across these names in the book, we don't quite know who they are. It always reminds me of Joyce's famous, Nabokov's famous lines about the four things that good readers need. Four things. And the two of them I remember. One of them is imagination, one of them is a good dictionary, and the third is a really good memory. And that's the real challenge for this book, is to remember these names, because we don't know exactly who they are, but they will come back. And Patrick McCabe is going to come back. I believe he's the man they're burying. I'm not sure. As we walk along, we start to play lots of games. He starts to imagine dialing, calling God on a telephone. Just do your best with this, because I have trouble with it. Page 47, he says, I mustn't forget his letter for the press. Again, remember, the very beginning of the paragraph on 47, he's talking about Deasy's letter, okay? And that letter is going to come up in the chapter. I've got that letter about foot and mouth disease. And after, okay, here's the paragraph. It's a much clearer set of thoughts. I mustn't forget his letter for the press. And after, the ship, 12:30. By the way, go easy with that money like a good young imbecile. Yes, I must. So the most clear thoughts here are, I'm meeting somebody at the ship is a pub. I think he's meeting Buck. And then he thinks, I got my money. I got to hold on to that money and not waste it. He's just got paid. All right. Now, this is the part that I find most confusing. At the bottom of page 47, he imagines going to his uncle's house. I pull the wheezy bell of their shuttered cottage and wait. They take me for a dun, peer out from a coign of vantage. Now, there's a little brief scene with his uncle and his aunt, who I believe isn't talking to him, that he's imagining. And then when I first read it, I thought he was actually stopping by his uncle's house. I don't know how you're supposed to figure that one out until we suddenly go back out of that house and we're back on the beach. So watch out for that passage. He then starts to make references to the Hwinahim, horse nostrils. Those are the horsemen of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. And what we get in that passage is this kind of sloppy uncle's house who's not very bright, who's drinking in bed, I think in the morning, I believe. He plans to have a pint of beer with Stephen in bed, or so Stephen imagines. And it comes out of it with the kind of Stephen's kind of contempt for the physicality and the animal quality of his family, who he's kind of disgusted by and he wants to get away from. Now, then he starts to go on to imagine about how when he was a young, there's a lot of imagining and remembering about how he wanted to be this great artist and how he's been to Paris and meetings with friends. And some of them are quite interesting, but I get lost in them. And he talks about at one point how I wish I was going to plan to write novels with just letters for the titles of the books. Super clever kid. No one's going to read these books, but he remembers his imagination of becoming a great artist. Now I want to come back to one other passage that I like. After going into this kind of flutter of memories and fantasies, bottom of page 50, I want you to see how quickly Joyce goes from the interior kind of jumble, clever jumble of Stephen's head, and then sees the world that Stephen sees. I'm going to read this whole paragraph because some beautiful little observations here. The grainy sand had gone from under his feet. Immediately in that sentence, we know we're outside his head and we're seeing him. We're not getting the jumble of it. We're not lost in his thoughts. His boots trod again a damp, crackling mast, razor shells, squeaking pebbles that on the unnumbered pebbles beats, wood sieved by the ship worm, lost armada. Sees this thing and then thinks about a lost armada. Unwholesome sand flats waited to suck his treading soles, breathing upward sewage breath. He coasted them, walked warily. A porter bottle stood up, stogged to its waist, filled with water halfway up, in the cakey sand dough. A sentinel, isle of dreadful thirst. Broken hoops on the shore. At the land, a maze of dark, cunning nets. Farther away, chalk-scrawled back doors, and on the higher beach, a drying line with 2 crucified shirts. Rings End, wigwams of brown steersmen and master mariners, human shells. All these lovely images of the sand and what it feels like and what it sounds like. And again, don't think about the Catholic imagery, just the image. You see these shirts hanging on the line as crucified. Don't think about this. There's a dissertation in the crucified church, but just a nice image that plants us in this walk across the beach. Now, I was going to go into a lot of interior, a lot of jokes here, a lot of puns. I hate Joyce's puns. They go on forever. And then his fantasies about how he's going to do these great things with his life. And we go back and forth about, he'll often mention mother dying, come home, father. Page 52, he remembers when he was in Paris, I believe. He's in Paris, and his father sends a telegram, your mother's dying. That's why he comes back. That's when he refused to pray with her. He refuses to come back to this world that he hates, this Catholicism and this backward country. And his contempt for that, he feels guilty because his mother died without his comfort. So we have Kevin Egan, we have lots of memories, and it's sometimes hard to tell when we're in the memories, when we're not. That all ends about page 55. So if you make it through page 55, I want to mark it here for you. You come out of it and you sort of see the rest of this chapter, and the rest of the chapter is pretty good. Chapter 55. He had come nearer the edge of the sea, and wet sand slapped his boots. Okay, look at page 55, or in that paragraph. And again, it's the beginning of a paragraph where we come out of this kind of soup of memory and we plant ourselves back on the beach. He starts to think about how he's got to go home tonight. And as he sits down on the beach, he sees a dead dog. A bloated carcass of a dog lay lolled on bladder rack. Before him, okay, so there's a dead dog. He looks at this dead dog, and he makes some, the jokes about it. And then he looks off down the beach, and he sees, on page 56, a live dog grew into sight, running across the sweep of sand. So look at this paragraph. He's sitting there reflecting on the dead dog. Then he sees a living dog coming up the way. Lord, is he going to attack me? Respect his liberty. You will not be master of others or their slave. I have my stick, his ash plant. Sit tight. From farther away, walking shoreward across from the crested tide, figures 2. And then he sees a man and a woman, fairly poor, fairly just hanging out, walking along with a dog, kind of slightly lower orders, they seem like. He doesn't know who they are. And this dog comes running, this live dog comes running along. And there's some really nice descriptions of this dog as it's rooting around along the beach and excited. And these two people following along behind them. At one point, he describes the dog and how dogs sniff at the ocean. They're so excited. He says it looks like he's looking for something lost in a past life. There's tons of reincarnation images here. Okay, don't forget about it. Just that image is so nice of this dog. And the description of the dog running along and the master hitting him. And we're just watching all this. In the middle of page 58, again, we have another one of those places where we have to identify the voice, where he's watching the dog come up. The live dog comes up to sniff at the dead dog. Reincarnation again. Forget it. Tatters! Out of that, you mongrel! The master shouts at his dog to get away from that dead creature. And we're sitting with Stephen watching this while the dog doesn't notice him. Okay, so there's a place here. We just sort of sit there for a while. I think I'm going to skip through most of this because most of this you should be able to follow. You're going to keep lapsing into these memories. But the actual descriptions of the boat on the beach are quite beautiful, and parts of them are really good. And he tears a piece of Deezy's letter off, and he writes something on it. And I forget what it is. I don't think they tell us. We're going to find that. I'm pretty sure that's going to come up later. So you have to, again, like Nabokov says, you have to have a good memory to read this book. So he writes something, and then he starts to reflect on women. He seems to be getting aroused. I'm not entirely sure, but his feelings for women get mixed up with his feelings of his mother. So whenever he starts to have some sort of attractive feelings about women or imagination of women, then he thinks of his mother dying. And that's kind of throwing him back and forth. There's a lovely portrait here at the end on page 62, or near the end, when he looks at the water as if it's women pulling up their skirts. And there's a visual image here I quite like. Page 62. And again, the ocean there's a dead body floating out there. It's a place where it's filled with death and all this horrible, destructive, broken stuff. And at the same time, he thinks that this feeling about women is really twisted in Stephen. Unlike Bloom, which is probably why people like Bloom so much. Bloom's feelings are a lot more positive. Page 62. Under the upswelling tide, he saw the writhing reeds lift languidly and sway reluctant arms, heising up their petticoats, in whispering water swaying and upturning coy silver fronds. Day by day, night by night, lifted, flooded, and let fall. So this endless passage of the ocean back and forth, and this notion of these skirts coming up and down, and this kind of almost monotonous, I don't want to say parade, but process of life and death is haunting Stephen when he's out there on the water. And he's thinking now he starts to think immediately when he goes from women, sexually attracted to women, then mom, dead, and then this thought of the dead body out in the water, you have the live dog and the dead dog. And all of this is basically just kind of seeping through Stephen. and he picks up at the end of the chapter. He picks up his ash plant, his walking stick, and he starts imagining where he's going to go and who he's going to meet. He's got to deliver the letter for Deasy to the newspaper, and he picks his nose. Ulysses has basically every physical bodily act you can imagine is committed in front of the reader in this book, and he picks his nose. And he's got some dried snot, so we know exactly what kind of snot it is, and he doesn't have his handkerchief because remember you have to remember all this stuff. I don't. I always forget this stuff, but he borrowed Buck borrowed his handkerchief, so he doesn't have where to wipe the snot, and he wipes it on a rock, and I'm pretty sure that snot comes back. I'm pretty sure somebody else sees that snot. So these are like little signs. Remember, he talks at the beginning of the chapter. Everything is a sign of something. The ocean, the water, the rocks, the shells, this piece of snot on a rock. They're all signs of something. And Joyce is sort of planting them all for us. And as he's walking along the beach at the end of it, he thinks someone's behind him. Stephen is walking off to the end of the chapter, and he turns around and he sees a ship out on the water, silent. Doesn't know if there's anyone on it or nothing. The notion that Stephen, who's a very isolated character in this book, looks back thinking he might see company, and there's nobody there. All right? So there are some really good passages in this chapter. I like it. I find it an extremely frustrating chapter. And if you find it frustrating, don't let it bother you. I would really try to just do your best through the first half. About page 55, you should be able to find your way. There's some beautiful stuff in it. So try to at least get that far. And then the last half of the chapter is quite good. That's the last we're going to see of Stephen for several hundred pages. I'm always glad of that, because by the time of chapter 3, I've had my fill of Stephen. And we'll have to decide what we think about him when he comes back. We're going to go to Bloom next. Those opening chapters of Bloom are, like the first 2 chapters of Ulysses, beautiful, great pieces of narrative writing. So you will have trouble with them, but not as much. All right, that's the end. For next week, we'll do chapter 4. We're going into part 2, the 4th chapter, the first chapter with Bloom. All right? Enjoy your reading, and don't sit in the bathtub too long because you get all pruny, you get all wrinkled. Okay, bye.